Thank you for being here this morning. Thank you for the invitation to be here. When Courtney started talking about kicking off a whole year of the Gospel of Matthew, it was pretty exciting for me because I've done so much work in the Gospel of Matthew, teaching courses in seminaries and colleges, mostly in the South and Northeast of the United States. So I brought all these video lectures, put them on a Canvas platform and put them out there for the teachers. Has anybody been able to look at those? Any of the teachers? There we go. Yeah, there's like 3 people. Okay, that's available to you. And if anybody wants access to that, you give me your email address and I'll hook you up with that platform. But today we're just going to do a broad overview of the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going to ask different questions about the Gospel of Matthew. And it gets right into the heart of biblical interpretation. How do we interpret the Bible, and kind of what is the Bible? So it all starts with kind of our doctrine of Scripture, or what we believe about the Bible. So I just say out loud, what are some of the beliefs you have about the Bible?
Salvation history.
Salvation history. Somebody went to seminary for that one. That's for sure. Who came up with salvation history? Who was that? Von Rad or?
Probably.
Yeah. What else? What are some things you believe about the Bible? It's the Word of God.
That shows us that God loves us. The history of God's love.
History, God's love.
Full of beginning.
Yeah.
Full of wisdom.
Full of wisdom. So those things the things that we believe about the Bible affect the way we read the Bible. So if you believe it's God's Word, you're going to approach it a certain way, right? You're going to ask certain questions. When you read the Bible, what kind of questions are you asking when you read it? Maybe even before you start reading, what are some of the questions that you want to have? There's no wrong answers here.
What did it mean to them, the people who read the original document? And what does it mean to us today? And what is the difference between the two?
Good call. That's very historical. That's a historical question. Yep.
How can I apply it to my life today?
How can I apply it to my life today? That is generally how most people read the Bible, if they read the Bible. What's God saying to me, right? That is a doctrine of Scripture. Like, you've got to believe that God's going to speak to you to ask those kind of questions. So what is the Bible? A lot of people talk about the Bible as a book of answers. And I like to push back against that as hard as I can, because the Bible is actually not a single book. It's a collection of books. It's a library. And instead of offering a ton of answers, the Bible asks a lot more questions than it gives answers. So instead of thinking it as a book of answers, I like to think about the Bible as a library of questions, which fundamentally shifts the way we approach Scripture, right? And then the Bible's sitting there, and so the question is, like, do we start with our doctrine of Scripture when we read, or do we just start with the text? Those are 2 fundamentally different ways to approach the Bible, right? If you have a strong conviction about this is what the Bible is, you're going to bring that to your reading. There's no way you can't. And if you sit there open and say, what can I learn from this text? It's a fundamentally different approach. You're a little bit more open. But can the Bible mean anything if it's sitting on a shelf? That's like a major question. Does the Bible mean anything without somebody actually reading it?
Means your daddy gave it to you.
Say, I didn't hear that out loud, but I sounded like, there you go. So when we start engaging Scriptures, that's when meaning starts to happen. What questions do we bring to the text will determine the answer. So if we're asking historical questions, what did the Bible say to the original listeners? We're going to get historical answers. And then when we say, what does it mean to me? What does this mean to me? That's a theological question that we're deriving from a historical context, right? And that's the process. So I'm just trying to outline these patterns that we have when we get meaning from Scripture. Theological questions. always have theological answers. Historical questions always have historical answers. Literary questions always have literary answers. So the questions we ask determine the meaning we have. So the intersection of text and reader, that's where meaning happens. Now, so I see an English professor here. So, this reader response criticism, it's not that we create our own meaning. We can, but meaning happens when we intersect with a text. When we start reading, something happens that creates meaning. And that's with any book, whether it's a novel or a book of history. When we start reading, that's when meaning happens. And it happens in our head. It doesn't happen anywhere else until what happens in our head turns into what happens in our heart and what happens in our hands. When we start actually doing the meaning that's been created. So the Bible can't speak. Only when we start reading it does it start to speak. And when it does, it speaks to us in that interaction of text and reader. All right. And look, just kind of shoot me with answers. I'm going to try to roll through this as fast as I can because we have time-limited space. But historical questions, Jim, this is like who wrote the Gospel of Matthew? When was it written? Where was it written? To whom was it written? Why was it written? How was it written? We're going to get to some of these questions today because I do want to kind of have a historical foundation in Matthew so that when, to start this whole year, if we're going to spend a whole year with the book, we may want to know kind of the foundations of it. But I will say, there is no large scholarly consensus about everything with the Gospel of Matthew. What I'm going to give you is, kind of what I think is about right based on as much scholars as I have. Who wrote the Gospel of Matthew isn't as simple as it sounds. The Gospel according to Matthew, which is the title, that didn't happen till 2nd century. None of the Gospels had those titles. And then you can look at church history that was written about when those titles got attributed to those books and how they got set up where they did. So I'm just going to glance over that and say that that's a harder issue than we're taking it, but I'm just going to call it Matthew. When was it written is an interesting question too. The Gospel of Matthew indicates that the writer knew that the destruction of Jerusalem had happened, and that happened in 70. So it has to be after 70, but not long after 70 because the content of the Gospel of Matthew. So most people think it's 80 to 90. That's the framework. Where was it written? To whom it was written? Why it was written? How it was written? These are big questions that I do want to talk about in this, I don't know how many minutes we have. So where was the Gospel of Matthew written? Here's two maps. The one that says Syria. Look at the bottom part of that where you have that red line that kind of angles towards the Mediterranean Sea. That's the same red line that's at the top of the one on the right where you have Galilee and Caesarea. So Syria came right now as Roman Syria. This was a Roman province, just like Judea was a Roman province during the Roman Empire. These were the borderlines during Jesus' time, right? And Matthew's time. So where was it written? Most scholars believe it was written somewhere between Galilee or Antioch. And you'll see Antioch in Syria, Galilee in Judea. Somewhere between there. It's about 100 miles or so between Antioch in Syria and the Galilee region. So we're not talking far. But what was happening in that space during the early Jesus movement, when people started believing things about Jesus as a Messiah, this area, the issues that these folks were dealing with have a lot to do with the issues in the Gospel of Matthew. So those are kind of the maps. This is a picture of the Sea of Galilee, just because it's cool and pretty and you should all go. And that's a modern fisherman in the Sea of Galilee. This was that region where Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, a lot of the setting in the Gospel of Matthew happens right here in the Galilee area, which is why a lot of people think, oh, this is definitely written to Galilee. But most likely, I'll say it's from Syria. This right here is a church in Capernaum. These are the ruins, what people think may have been Peter's house, because the church in the backside is built over the ruins of an ancient synagogue, which a lot of people think that's where Jesus taught in that synagogue. And then when they walked out of that synagogue to go to Peter's house and had to deal with his in-laws, that was in this place, right? So why was it written? I mean, the Gospel of Matthew addresses this question over and over and again. How does the Jesus tradition, these things that people are starting to believe about Jesus, how does that relate to Judaism? How does it relate to being a Jew? How does it relate to the Torah, their Bible? How does it relate to Jewish tradition? Matthew, out of the four Gospels, Matthew is the most Jewish-centric Gospel. It deals with the Torah almost from beginning to end. Any kind of modern Jew would read the Gospel of Matthew outside of the Jesus stuff would be like, oh yeah, definitely, this is rabbinic literature. Even the way Jesus reinterprets the Torah in the Sermon on the Mount, the big first sermon where Jesus says, you have heard that it's been said, and then he gives sometimes a 10 Commandment. But I'm telling you this. That kind of position of Jesus as a new Moses, Jesus as a new lawgiver, that's very Jewish. So Matthew is chock full of space dealing with what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus as a Jew in this emerging movement. Because when Jesus was crucified and resurrected, Christianity didn't happen immediately. It took a long time for enough believers to start believing that before it was a thing. And Matthew is the process of that becoming a thing that became Christianity. Does that make sense? So what we're reading in the Gospel of Matthew is some of those earliest questions about what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? We're all Jews who follow Jesus. And then the next big question is, can anybody else follow Jesus? How do we deal with Gentiles? Do we include Gentiles or are they out? If we do include them, how do we include them? Do they have to follow the law like everybody else? Or because they're Gentiles, do they have like some special space where they don't have to follow Jewish law, specifically circumcision? Now that's a pretty big barrier in the Greco-Roman world. When you look at religions in the first century, not many of them required male circumcision. And in fact, when in the Greek and Roman period, especially during the Colosseum and the games, men would compete naked, right? They would wrestle naked, they would run naked. And so you could see if people were circumcised or not. And Gentiles were not circumcised. So for a Gentile to convert to Christianity or this Jesus movement, did they have to be circumcised like they would have if they became Jewish? Because again, this is a Jewish movement at this point. So those are real questions that folks are really dealing with about being faithful to the Bible, the law, the Torah, and being faithful to this Jesus movement. What did that look like? So the Judaism, how the Gospel of Matthew relates to Judaism and how it relates to the inclusion of Gentiles are two main issues. And these two questions, and this to context, these two questions are asked under Roman imperialism. Throughout every book in the Bible, every book in the New Testament, I should say, is written under the austere hand of the Roman Empire. So all of these authors are negotiating identity in relation to Roman power that is absolute. And Roman power took the most violent position in local leaders, like people like Herod and those kind of client kings. So this is why Matthew is written. The whole Gospel of Matthew is written is to say this is who Jesus is in these contexts, and this is how Jesus answers these questions for us. So the Antioch context in Galatians and Acts. I'm going to give you some ideas of how we ended up talking about Antioch. Galatians is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, writing in the New Testament. And it's just a letter, right? Paul writes to the region of Galatia. And when he writes to the region of Galatia, what's the most famous thing about the Galatians? Anybody remember that? Who reads Galatians all the time?
Were they fighting over circumcision?
There was an argument fighting over circumcision, but between who? Who wrote Galatians?
Wasn't it Peter and Paul?
Peter and Paul, right? Peter and Paul. And Paul wrote Galatians. And Paul, Galatians is fantastic because Paul's like, I met Peter in Antioch. I mean, he's really kind of beefing up some power in Galatians. And he gets on to Peter because Peter withdrew from table fellowship from the Gentiles. And he's no longer eating with those Gentiles. He's only eating with Jews in Antioch, right? And so Paul says, I confronted him to his face. And so Paul in Galatians is always getting in trouble with Peter and men from James and this kind of power that exists in the church of Jerusalem. Like there's a power center there. And Paul is always kind of bucking that system. And the reason that he's having confrontation there is because Paul wants to include Gentiles without them being circumcised or following the Bible as they had it. So Paul comes off as a radical liberal by saying, just let them all come in. All they have to do is believe, have faith in. That's all Gentiles have to do. And now they're a part of this Jewish movement believing in Jesus. Now, does radical inclusion make people uncomfortable? I mean, that's a big question right now, right? The Galatians, there's actually other part in Acts chapter 15, Acts chapter 21. They call it the Jerusalem Council, where Paul has to come to Jerusalem and give an account of his gospel. Galatians, he talks about that too, and he says, I gave an account to the gospel so that I didn't run in vain. Paul talks a lot about running in vain. So the major issue there is how and if Gentiles are included, and if they are, what do they have to do? So when Matthew was written, like I said, Christianity wasn't a thing, but it's becoming a thing. This was a Jewish movement based on faith in the person of Jesus. All the early people who believed in Jesus were Jewish. They were not Gentiles. Paul confronts Peter in Antioch regarding Jewish inclusion. And Paul argues for full inclusion without following normal Jewish customs, circumcision in particular. And so the Gospel of Matthew is a voice in this discussion regarding Gentile inclusion in a Jewish Jesus movement. Now that might be a lot to kind of say in one sentence, but Matthew has probably heard about Paul's letter to the Galatians because that comes early on, around 50, mid-40s, 50. This is 40 years later. The letter to the Galatians is circulating in churches at this point, and Matthew's trying to clarify who Jesus is and what Jesus means for this Jewish movement that is trying to figure out how to include Gentiles. So, after saying all that, how was Matthew written? Now, this is where this also makes people uncomfortable. I love graphs and charts. I mean, I started in school as an engineer, so, pie charts just hit me in a very warm spot. But when we're talking about the Gospel of Matthew or any writing of the New Testament, what image do you have in your mind of Matthew sitting down at a desk to write the Gospel? What does that look like to you?
He's got Mark on his right side and he's explaining it to me.
Okay. That's very good. Thank you. That's better than I thought I was going to get. A lot of people believe in the inspiration, divine inspiration, right? like these writers are sitting at a desk somewhere and all of a sudden psh, lightning bolt comes and they're just, they're just kind of this intermediary between God and ink on paper, or papyrus, I should say. But there's no printing press, so these folks are handwriting it. The question is, like, did Matthew have sources? Like, anybody who's written a book or who's written a paper for school? Okay. What's the biggest thing about a research paper? Sources. You got to, and what do you got to do with your sources? Cite your sources. Guess what? Guess what ancient people did not have to do? They didn't have to cite their sources at all, right? But there's these places, and this is what this chart looks like. You see that triple tradition right in the middle? Matthew and Luke use so much of the Gospel of Mark when they write. So there's these sections of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are almost verbatim the same. If you've ever read through the Gospels, you're like, didn't I read this somewhere before? And you're like, oh, I read this in Matthew because Matthew starts. It's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you read them in that order, by the time you get to Mark, you're like, this is the same story, right? Luke, same story. Well, it's because it is the same story. And the fact of the matter is, it's called the triple tradition, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say the exact same thing, almost verbatim. Like, how do you get three authors that are writing verbatim?
It's plagiarism.
It's plagiarism, right? Let me tell you something. Anybody going to college? It is now. I mean, you need to know that. High school students, college students, that's called plagiarism. It wasn't plagiarism then. I mean, it's totally common for writers to use different sources in antiquity and just take large portions of it. And what we think is that Mark was written first, because we don't know if Mark knows about the destruction of the temple. So Mark was probably pre-70. But because Luke and Matthew have so much of Mark in their Gospels, they probably had a written copy of the Gospel of Mark as they're writing their Gospels. Now, the thing is, if you read Mark and Matthew or Mark and Luke, what you'll find, there's something missing in Mark that's in both of those. And that's these long sermons of Jesus. Matthew is just kind of a story of the events. And the link is always immediately. And then immediately, count how many times you read the word immediately in the Gospel of Mark. So it's a pretty fast-paced narrative. Matthew pulls some of that immediately out, uses the chronological order of Mark, but then in both Matthew and Luke, Jesus begins to teach. You don't have a lot of teachings, long teachings or sermons of Jesus in Mark. But Matthew and Luke both have these big, long parts of Jesus speaking, right? And then you look down at the double tradition, that's where Matthew and Luke have verbatim stuff, or real close to verbatim stuff, that's not in Mark at all. So how do you explain where Matthew and Luke have exactly the same stuff and it's not in Mark? Well, did one have a copy of the gospel, the other's gospel? Did Luke know Matthew? Did Matthew know Luke as far as like having their gospel in hand? Most people think they don't. And the reason they don't is because of the birth narrative, really. The birth narrative in Matthew and Luke are irreconcilable. If you just all you have to do is read them, and they do not fit together. But what do? We make them fit together, right? We just jam them together, right? Well, that's, literally, you just read it, you read the chronology, look at how Matthew and Luke 1 through 4 are kind of structured. They're not using the same material. And so if Matthew had a copy of Luke, could he have written his birth narrative the way he wrote it? And if Luke had a gospel of Matthew, could he have written his birth narrative the way he wrote it? Most likely not. Most likely didn't know each other. So how do you explain where they do this double tradition that's very similar? Most scholars think that they have another source that they share in common, and we call that the Q source. So if you ever hear the Q source and you go, ooh, it's nothing more than this shared source that Matthew and Luke had when they wrote their gospel. So we think that Matthew and Luke both had a copy of Mark and a copy of this saying source of Jesus, these sayings of Jesus or these sermons of Jesus. And Matthew uses the Q source, or this source of Jesus' sayings, and builds more narrative, more Jesus' teaching around the events of Jesus' life. So he gets that narrative of Mark that's almost followed directly. And then he builds these sayings of Jesus, these sermons of Jesus, around the skeleton of Mark. So he's expanding Mark, but for a very specific reason. How do we deal with Gentiles, and how much of the Jewish covenant do we hold? How do we be faithful to both of these things? Is this confusing? I mean, some people get bogged down in this. The other part is that there's some space that is just uniquely Matthew and uniquely Luke. It's not in either one of the other two Gospels. And when Matthew starts speaking and it's only his stuff, pay real close attention, because now we're getting to the heart of Matthew. Luke, you got about 20% of that in Matthew, about 35% of Luke is only Luke. And you look at how much Matthew actually uses Mark. He uses like 94% of the Gospel of Mark in his Gospel. Now, does this make you feel uncomfortable that Matthew and Luke use sources? Sometimes it kind of rubs people the wrong way and it makes them feel like, ugh.
I want to ask you something.
Yep.
Didn't they see each other and talk a lot about this and discuss this? They were disciples with him.
You would think, but again, the title, The Gospel According to Matthew, wasn't on these original documents. That came way later with folks who received this text and tried to figure out what's the title of this. And so almost a century later, scholars were like, this is the Gospel according to Matthew. And so that's how those titles came up. So were these guys all in the same place talking to each other? Probably not. Matthew in Antioch, Syria, that's a very different location. And you got to think about technology. Like, how fast can you get from point A to point B? You can't send an email. You can't call each other. You can't text. You can send a letter, but that letter is going to take a long time for it get to. So when you got these pockets of writings happening, they're happening all over the Greco-Roman world, and they may or may not know each other. So that's what we're up against there. But what we can know is all these verbatim pieces of Mark in Matthew, and where Matthew and Luke agree. We can see that because it's there. How did that come about? That's kind of what we're trying to figure out, right? So how was it written is pretty important to the context itself. So here's another. So we believe that Mark was written first. That's called Markan priority. Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source to write their Gospels. That's called the triple tradition. Matthew and Luke didn't know each other based on the birth narratives. But Matthew and Luke have this large section that's very similar to the double tradition. So scholars believe that they had another common source, which was most likely made up of sayings or sermons of Jesus, and we call this Q.
Do you want to say something about John, just briefly?
Oh, man. Yeah, John is completely different. That's why. Is there a birth narrative in the Gospel of John? No. Like, John 1 is not a birth narrative. John 1 is the creation story. And so it projects Jesus all the way to the creation of the world. Matthew and Luke, and we call these the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they do not go that far back. And that's because as Christianity continued to grow forward and build theology around things, that theology started going farther and farther back. When you wrote a gospel, like when Jesus died, there was people that believed in the resurrection. And then there's letters writing about the resurrection and the crucifixion. And then when they started writing narrative, Mark started saying, oh, well, Jesus also did miracles. And, then you have miracle story projected back. And then Matthew, there's no birth narrative in Mark either. It's not that important when he writes it. When Matthew and Luke come along, they go farther back. Oh, it was miraculous even from birth. And then when John gets there, it's like, nope, not from birth. From the creation of the world, right? So the bigger the theology got, as Christianity grew and became something, the larger the theology got. I know that might feel very uncomfortable, but that historically, that's how it happened.
How did these people like just sit around writing all this? How did they make a living?
That's a great question. Well, Matthew, I mean, you hear Matthew critique scribes a lot, scribes and Pharisees. We're Northside Baptist Church. We are part of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. Who's our biggest enemy in the world? Southern Baptists, right? We're like, oh, Southern Baptists. Who's the closest to us in the world? Southern Baptists, right? Who's Matthew just so uptight about? It's the scribes and Pharisees. So what is Matthew most likely? A scribe. He's writing this thing down, right? And they did get paid. And kind of this emerging movement taking care of each other. He probably was commissioned to do something like that. Whoever he was. Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe he's a scholar. I don't know.
So shouldn't we say the writer of Matthew, because it wasn't Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, for convenience sake, we talk about Matthew. I mean, that's...
Sometimes, I grew up learning that Matthew actually wrote it.
Right.
But that's not true.
Yeah.
The writer of Matthew, even when you look at it, it doesn't say anything about Matthew.
It does
writing
not.
anything.
No. But what we can do is there is like Christian writings in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century where we see those early folks talking about this. And so we can read about what they thought it was. And by 312, Eusebius writes his church history. And when he writes it, he's talking about like what is the New Testament? Because at 312, there wasn't a thing called the New Testament. And Eusebius going, these books are definitely in. These books are definitely not in. The Revelation, 2nd, 3rd John, 2nd Peter, none of that. He was like, these are definitely not in the New Testament. And then he's like, well, and these might be. And then he had some of the definitely nots in the maybe. So they were trying to figure it out in real time. And you got stuff like that too. So this is the two source hypothesis that Matthew and Luke had these two sources.
The first complete list of the actual contents of the New Testament is in the Easter letter of Bishop
Athanasius, right.
367.
Yep. 367. That's when we get the first time all 27 books, no more, no less, are in a single list.
And we should say that part of that was to separate out the things that were in the list from what was not in the list.
That's exactly
And
right.
part of that was authorship,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So if we could say, oh, this person was attached to Jesus,
Right.
that document must be more important than this document, which looks suspiciously like it.
Yeah. Eyewitness report,
Yeah.
right? Matthew, by saying Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, puts it as an eyewitness to Jesus, which makes it more credible.
And that's probably how Hebrews got attributed
Yeah,
to
for
Paul
sure.
in the first place.
100%.
To add prestige to it because it was such an importance.
Yeah, Hebrews doesn't say it's from Paul at all, but by the time the reason it gets picked up in the New Testament is because people started attributing it to Paul. I want to get to a couple things. Okay, we're not too bad. When is this over? 9:15. Okay. All right. Here's a brief outline of Matthew. Matthew 1 through 4 is kind of the birth narrative and the beginning of Jesus' ministry. His baptism is in this section. We'll talk about the baptism stories in Mark. So Luke and Matthew use that. And then we're going to see how do they use that? Like, do they mess with it a little bit when they're writing their Gospels? 5 through 7 is Jesus' first sermon in the Gospel of Matthew. This is not in Mark at all, but it is in Luke's. Portions of it is in Luke. But Matthew, it's called the Sermon on the Mount because Jesus goes up to the mount and gives the new, it's almost the new covenant, the new law. He is definitely a Moses figure on this first sermon. And when it's the first sermon, it's like really important. Jesus is going to give his modus operandi here. Matthew 8 through 12, I just have it like second sermon, third sermon, fourth sermon, fifth sermon, because that is Matthew does that, right? He builds the chronology of Mark around the saying source. And every one of those sermons, you can find stuff in Luke. So that's where he's using Q source for sure and building it out. So this rough structure of Matthew is birth narrative, baptism narrative called the ministry, these sermons with Mark's structure, and then the crucifixion and resurrection in 26 through 28. So that's kind of how Matthew functions. Luke is a different kind of structure than that. Luke does a little bit different stuff.
Jason?
Yep.
No accident, of course, that the number of the sermons is 5.
Right. All right. I'm trying my best to get to all this. So when Matthew is using a source, either Matthew, Mark, or Q, how is he editing it? And what does that say about Matthew? So this is like when you're trying to get to like what's Matthew doing, watch how he uses his sources. Just like any other kind of book you read. When you're, especially academic stuff, when you're reading like how is this writer using their sources, like so-and-so says this. Is that writer going, and I believe they're right, and here's why I think they're right? Or is the person reading the source and going, this is what they say, and I disagree. Well, you can see how Matthew uses the Q source and uses Mark and kind of rearranges it to make a real strong point. And those points usually have to do with Gentile inclusion and how to deal with the Jewish tradition and Torah. One of the biggest parts of Matthew that kind of show this is in Mark, there's this story of the Syrophoenician woman. Do you guys know that story? What happens to the Syrophoenician woman? She comes to Jesus asking for what? Healing for their daughter. And what does Jesus say to her in Mark?
The dogs don't get the
I mean, well, that's a pretty hard one, right? We don't like Jesus calling a woman a dog. But Syrophoenician, where is that? Gentile territory, right? But Syrophoenicia was a real place during the time Mark and Matthew were written, right? When you said Syrophoenicia, it would be like us talking about West Jackson. Like, we know where that is. It's a real thing. What does Matthew do with that story? He doesn't call her Syrophoenician. He calls her Canaanite. And where are the Canaanites in the first century? They don't exist anymore. They've been annihilated, genocide, right? It would be like us, I don't even know, what to compare. It would be like us talking about Philistines today. All those Philistines living in West Jackson, right? Like it doesn't exist. So when Matthew says Canaanite, what is he saying? He's saying she's not just Gentile. She is the arch enemy of historic Israel, which gets to two things: Torah, Jewish tradition. Like we go way back. And who is she? She's our arch enemy, which kind of helps understand why you'd be like dog, right? Because she's an enemy. But what happens to that Canaanite enemy in Matthew? What is he? He says, nobody in Israel has the faith of this one, so I guess I got to do it, right? So there is an inclusion of Gentiles, and you can see it how he's editing the story of Mark. There's an inclusion of Gentiles, but how is it included? Come on in, like Paul? Or is it like, if we have to, we have to? That's Matthew's stance almost throughout about Gentile inclusion. Yes, you've got to include them because we have to, right? Even Jesus is like, golly, what do we do with these people? I guess they can come on in, right? So that's when we're really getting to Matthew, watching how Matthew uses Mark, how he uses the Q source really says something about him. So here it is. The Q source, the Sermon on the Mount comes from the Q source. And what does Matthew say right out of the gates? Blessed are the poor. Period? No. And we love Matthew because we like spiritualizing that to death. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake. Luke uses that exact same source and said, blessed are the poor. Period. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Period. Luke has a strong money ethic running throughout both Luke and Acts. Matthew doesn't have that so much. So Matthew's using the Q source in a different way. Now, what we don't know is in spirit or, for righteousness' sake, is that in part of the Q source, or did Matthew add that? We don't know that. But all we know is that Matthew has it, Luke doesn't. Did Luke take that out? It's really no way to tell. But Luke certainly has a program about money and money ethic throughout. But that's how, what's happening there when Matthew's using their sources. This is another one that's interesting, the way they use Mark in the baptism story of Jesus. Mark, in Matthew, it says, "This is my beloved Son, with him I am well pleased." So when you say something like that, this is God saying it, right? And if God said, "This is my beloved Son, in him I'm well pleased," who's he talking to? He's talking to the crowd. He's talking to everybody. And in Luke says, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." Who was God talking to then? Directly to Jesus. So Matthew makes this a statement to everybody. And what's Matthew's program? This is who Jesus is. He is the Messiah, the Son of God, right? And Luke doesn't, that's not Luke's program. Luke's trying to do something different. But he's embedding Jesus into the history of Israel, salvation history. Like it's a direct line from ancient Judaism to what's happening here. And we've got that line right. And everybody should know it. So that's how he's using Mark. And then his own material. What is he doing with his own material? The parable of the sheep and goats is only found in Matthew and nowhere else in the Bible. So what does the sheep and goats say about Matthew? Like this is Matthew's core theology. And that's pretty intense, right? Now the big question is, what does this have to say about Matthew's conception of salvation? Is this, if you just believe, you're fine? What, if you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. When did we do it to you? We never did this. When you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Welcome into eternal paradise, my beloved servant. When you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me. Well, we didn't see you like this. When because you didn't do these things, here's eternal damnation forever, right? So the goats go to hell based on their belief in Jesus? Well, they did. Which is, again, like this is very counter Paul, the idea of like just believe, but it's also very Jewish. Obey the law. Do what you're supposed to be doing. What does the rich young ruler do in Matthew? Like, how do I supposed to be saved? Do the commandments. I've done all the commandments since birth. Well, you lack one thing. Sell all your possessions, give it to the poor, and follow me. And he walked away sad because he had many possessions, right? That's a very Matthew story. Salvation is not just this belief, it's actually what you do. So Matthew, when you're looking at like core Matthew stuff, watch how Matthew uses his source in Mark. Watch how he uses his source in Q. Watch what he says individually. So how can Matthew's core principles inform our lives? I mean, we're going to wrap it all the way back around and talk about us now. And I do think, like, what is God going to say to me about? It's a very selfish question to ask. But it's okay to ask that kind of in personal piety and personal devotion, your quiet time. It's not a bad question to ask. But when you lift up, kind of asking God speaking directly to you, when you lift that up for everybody else to follow, it's a little selfish. So just be very careful there that a lot of bad things have been done in the name of God based on what people may or may not have heard from God in these kind of situations. So how can we apply Matthew's core principles to inform our lives? Although reluctantly, Matthew practices radical inclusion to the Gentiles. He never says that Gentiles have to be circumcised. He never says that Gentiles have to do the law of Israel. But he does say over and over and over again, we're letting them in, but. That's very different than Paul. That's very different than John. That's different than Luke. Luke is much more accepting of Gentiles than Matthew is. And watch how Luke handles those sources, right? So, but in all, and this is the powerful thing about the New Testament, all the New Testament passages that get, the books that become part of the New Testament, all of them are dealing with the issue of Gentile inclusion. And all of the New Testament makes the choice to include rather than exclude. So the Bible says, all right, actually the New Testament says inclusion, whether radical inclusion or begrudging inclusion, it's still inclusion. I think that can inform how we do church in modernity. You might not like all the folks that we include, but you can be like Matthew and be like, well, I mean, we just can't not let them in. Canaanite dog. I mean, you want to be a little bit better than that, but that's still like you're letting them in, right? Matthew portrays Jesus as one who will disregard tradition in order to help those who are disenfranchised over and over and over and over again. All the miracles in Matthew, almost all of them, get him in trouble with the religious establishment because he has embraced healing, embraced care, embraced concern for the most vulnerable, and bypassed his own religious tradition to do so. What does that look like for us in Mississippi right now? What does it look like for us to say, you know what, my religious tradition has always said this, but I got to help so-and-so. That's strong. Matthew always sides with the most vulnerable and outcast. Matthew 25, right? I mean, man, if you hear anything from Matthew, you better take care of the least of these, because you will burn in hell if you don't. I mean, that's exactly what Matthew 25 says. We like Matthew 25 because we're like, oh, it's so warm and cozy. We're supposed to take, of course, we're going to be the ones taken care of. But be careful. There's the goats are just right there. The goats are right there. So take care of the most vulnerable and outcasts throughout. And then Matthew almost always is critical of those in power, both political power and religious power. Not critical of religion, period. Not critical of Judaism. Matthew's very pro-Judaism, pro-Torah, but he is very critical of those who are in power in the religious establishment. The Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, Herod. Like, does Herod come off as a good guy? No, he's like the ultimate bad guy. And why is he the ultimate bad guy? Because he is a puppet of Rome. Pontius Pilate is not let off in Matthew like he's let off in some other Gospels. Every time Matthew can be critical of power, those in power, he is. Both Roman and Judean power and religious power. Always critical of the Pharisees. And Matthew is like, you brood of vipers. And that's at Jesus' baptism, right? John the baptism in chapter 2, it starts off like the worst people in the world, Pharisees, brood of vipers, right? How does this inform us today? Like, don't be those guys. Don't be a Pharisee. And I was having a conversation with a guy, a medical leader this past week, and he was a former Southern Baptist missionary to Korea. Came back home, ran UMMC for years, and then became chancellor of Ole Miss. And he is like, this is his thing. He cares for the most vulnerable, right? He called Baptist leaders in the state of Mississippi Pharisees because they won't stand up for the most vulnerable. Why can't the Mississippi Baptist Convention stand up for the most vulnerable around policy that's going to directly help them? They're Pharisees. And I was like, ugh. I don't want to be a Pharisee. I'll say something, whatever you want me to say, right? Good lesson, right? So I think these are at least 4 bullet points when we look at the Gospel of Matthew in totality, its historical context, what it might mean for us. These 4 bullet points are kind of get at the heart of the Gospel of Matthew. So that's an introduction. What kind of questions do you have just before we break out and go to worship?
You go back one slide.
Yep, I think. Oh my goodness, oh, it's off. I turned it off. Which one? All four of them?
Just leave it up there.
Okay. There we go. Susan?
Not to interrupt any questions, but I just thank you so much, Jason, thank you. The wonderful thing is, he is a member of our church, so if you have any other questions, as you're reading through Matthew this year, Jason is there for us, so grateful. Thank you, this is wonderful. There are books as you leave at the back. There is a slightly thicker one is for our Sunday school teachers, and also there's a student book. So if you would like one, take one. This will help us as we probably get to about Easter. We'll decide where we'll go during the summer, but this is a good for a beginning, and our teachers will be using them if they so choose. But anyway, take these, teachers, and then the smaller student book, and it does say Study Guide for members of the class. It says Teaching Guide for the teachers. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Go in peace.